Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. Today's guest is National Parks advocate Audrey Peterman. Audrey is president and co-founder of Earthwise Productions, and in 2014, she co-launched the Diverse Environmental Leaders Speakers Bureau. Earthwise Productions focuses on connecting the public land system and the American public. She also serves as a trustee of the National Parks Conservation Association. Audrey, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's a thrill to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. So let's get right to it. So the first question I wanted to ask you was, what motivated you to begin this journey to connect Americans to their national parks and public lands?
Well, I fell into it kind of by accident because I managed to luck out and marry a man that's so wonderful, Frank, yes? And shortly, as a matter of fact, we were friends for a really long time before we took a romantic interest in each other. And I went to visit him once, and he was working on a cardboard cutout of a house that he said he wanted to build in Belize in Central America. Uh-huh. And I was like, well, you're not going to Belize without me. And he's like, I wouldn't. Bringing a woman that you're not romantically involved with to Belize would be like bringing coals to Newcastle. So anyway, shortly after that, we got married, and then we went to Belize with the prospects of building a bed and breakfast there. We had this dream about going to bed at night with the sound of the howler monkeys in our ears, And we had decided to move there. And just a few days before we came back home to the States to, sell off our things and pack up, Frank was in a bar having a drink with a Belizean gentleman. And they got to talking about the cowboy movies that they both grew up watching. And, those great scenes of the Badlands, etc. So the gentleman said to Frank, well, what do the Badlands look like? And Frank had to say, I don't know. I've never seen them. And the man was like, but you live in America, right? And Frank said, yes, but I've never been to the Badlands. And the gentleman said, okay, then what about the Grand Canyon? What does the Grand Canyon look like? And Frank again was forced to say, I don't know. I've never seen the Grand Canyon. So then when we came home, Frank said, honey, we can't go to Belize or anywhere else because we don't know our own country. And although I'm, a naturalized American, he said, let's take off a couple of months and just go driving around the country to these places that millions of people from all over the world come here every year to see. And they're driving distance in our backyard and we've never seen them. So at that time, we had no concept, really. I had no concept of national park. I was just going to see the Grand Canyon. And he said we had to see Yellowstone and Yosemite. But I had no concept of the fact that there was such a thing as a national park system at that time.
Hmm. And this was when? What year was this?
1995. We left in August 1995. We started out on our big trip.
So that was your first experience with national parks. So then what led you to get so, I don't know what to say, integrally involved?
Committed.
Committed. And then desirous of getting other people involved, involving other Americans, not just with the national parks, but with their public lands.
Well, we drove to New York and then we drove up to Maine. So we arrived in Bar Harbor, Maine, which is such a beautiful town. Yes. And then we drove into this exquisitely beautiful natural area, which, as it turned out, was Acadia National Park. And I don't know, have you been to Acadia?
Oh, yes, many times.
Oh, of course, you would have been. And do you know that W.E.B. Du Bois was there, too, near the turn of the 20th century?
Absolutely.
Yes, he talks about that in his book, Blackwater. But anyway, I did not know any of this at the time. So we drive into this place of lush greenery. And you know how the forest is like a fringe, like a hula skirt around the base of Cadillac Mountain. Then we drove up Cadillac Mountain and, suddenly we were above the clouds and the clouds were below us. And then we were deposited into this space of such unearthly beauty that I couldn't even believe it was real. I mean, it didn't look like the same earth that I had been inhabiting up till then for 40 odd years. And, breathtaking does not begin to describe it. But as I looked out over that vast expanse of untouched natural beauty, I had an epiphany, a transformative experience. I felt like somebody who had lived in a mansion my whole entire life. And until then, all I had seen was the kitchen.
Oh, yes.
And while the kitchen is serviceable and necessary, suddenly now I was deposited in what was the grand living room, the area of art and beauty. That's what it felt like. And I also tell people I had the experience of falling in love with myself in that place, because the beauty that I saw was so transcendent. Mm-hmm. And I thought the same entity that made all of that made me. Yeah. So as that is beautiful and perfect, I must be beautiful and perfect too. Mm-hmm. And so since then, I've just seen myself as beautiful and perfect. And that was 25 years ago. But the big plus to that was I saw everything and everyone else as beautiful and perfect too. Oh, and then I realized there was only one other Black person on that mountain. And she was a young lady who had come, told us she'd come on a bus trip from New York. Mm-hmm. And as we continued around the country, going to the jaw-dropping Badlands, to Yellowstone, which I discovered was not just the old faithful geyser, but in fact contained half of all the geysers on planet Earth. I mean, it was so stupendous. My mind was completely blown. And it was in Yellowstone that I realized in Acadia I had seen National Park, Acadia National Park. Now I'd seen Badlands National Park. Now I was seeing Yellowstone National Park. So finally I said, what the heck is a national park? And when I found out, and I realized I was not seeing any Black people or any brown people among the Park Service employees or the visitors, both Frank and I looked at each other and said, something's wrong here. This has to change. Mm-hmm. So we drove all the way out to Washington State and went to the whole rainforest. Who even knew that there was a rainforest in America?
And you're talking about Olympic National Park.
Olympic National Park, yes. Mm-hmm. So we were so overcome with love and amazement. And then, of course, the feeling of freedom and self-sufficiency, the realization that we did not need all the trappings with which we surround ourselves, mm-hmm. In city life. And talking to our friends who were Wall Street bankers and college presidents and network news anchors and telling them about all this beauty and all these places. And they kept looking at us like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Because they did not know these places either. And so we decided that we had to do something about it. And so we've been trying to do something about that since 1995.
That's just
I think
amazing.
Every working day, I do something about parks.
So your focus has been on connecting people who have no or limited experience with national parks. And you just mentioned even news anchors and corporate people, and but particularly people of color. Yes. So why is that? Why did you focus on people of color and people in general who hadn't experienced national parks or our public lands before?
Well, I do focus in general, but most acutely on non-white people, because nobody else was focusing on them. Mm-hmm. We saw hundreds of thousands of white people, so obviously they were getting the message somehow, whether by tradition or other. But since we saw no people of color, it was clear to us that that was where we needed to focus our efforts, because we could relate. I mean, imagine somebody living in, public housing mm-hmm. in New York City or elsewhere in any large city, not even being able to see a tree or barely being able to see a scraggly tree, not mm-hmm. having a relationship with nature, not, playing in the stream, not having a daily connection with nature. The oppression that they feel, to my mind, is part of the reason that, people are so unhappy. And I wanted to show that in this gorgeous country of America, we had these places set aside for our enjoyment and education, and on top of that, we were all paying for them with our taxes, with our tax dollars. So it was very important to me to and to Frank to let people like us know that the parks exist and what they represent.
Well, you touched upon something very important. You said, people that are isolated in the city, whether it be public housing or yes. just even a condominium or a high-rise
right.
house or apartment. I know many people that live in New York like that, who've lived all their lives or in the inner city of Los Angeles, where I grew up. But you touched on something important. You said it was important to their health and well-being as
Oh,
well.
yes. Yes, yes. Well, I have the experience. I just finished writing my third book. In December, it was published. It's called From My Jamaican Gully to the World.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, I describe how growing up in Jamaica and having a gully, which is a little stream, a burbling stream
Mm-hmm.
running behind my house, where I could sit on the banks of the gully for hours by myself, just looking at the little fish in the water, looking at the occasional shrimp that would pop out or an occasional eel, listening to the birds, feeling the wind, on my face. All of those things really habituated me to nature and sensitized me to nature. So wherever I go, I am always looking for that natural connection because to me, I can't live without it. And, literally, I had the privilege of meeting E.O. Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
um, the
Yes, I know him
naturalist philosopher
well.
who came up with the theory of biophilia,
Oh,
in
yes.
which he said that human beings need nature not just for recreation, but we need it as a biological imperative because we evolved in nature. So we need it for health, mental, physical, emotional health, and well being. And you can see now in society it's playing out what the retrenchment from nature has produced. So many young people who don't go further than the plug, that they can plug in their games, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm hoping that now that we've had this period of enforced confinement, when people are able to come out, their curiosity will really be stirred and their wanderlust will be ignited.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. You mentioned D.O. Wilson. When he first wrote that book, he and I were on the old Osgood program. We were just talking about being interviewed, and that was a interview I did many years ago when that book first came out. But then it led me to do further research, and that concept was actually put forward as well by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. When he wrote to the California legislature explaining why they should be supportive of Yosemite National Park. He made the point that the health and well-being of human beings depended upon recreation in natural areas. And it was interesting because he went on to say that the most important people in society that needed it most were the farm workers and housewives who were often isolated from nature and didn't have an opportunity to get out and experience the healing powers of nature. So I'm so glad
Yes,
you brought that up. That's just that's so important.
yes.
Absolutely. Well, tell me, how well have some of the programs you've worked so hard to institute over the years have worked? Has there been any progress?
Oh my goodness. I mean, it's a totally different venue now from when we first began. When we started in 1995, we were so happy to meet you in the Park Service because there was a relatively small number of African Americans that we were exposed to anyway. You and Bob Standen were our shining light. Incidentally, I have to tell you that on Tuesday night, we had the privilege of watching Bob Stanton virtually get a Murray Conservation Award from the Teton Science Center in Grand Teton National Park. So
Oh, that's
inspiring.
wonderful. That would have
Since
been
he,
inspiring.
yes, since he was sent out to the Grand Tetons in the 60s. So
Yeah.
he's come almost full circle. I mean, 50 something years now, right? But
Yes.
some of the programs that there is now a vital and very energized network of people of color in every state in the country actively working on getting recreational experiences for the communities that they serve and that they live in. And many of them are unpaid. They're not making a living doing this. They're doing this in addition to their regular jobs. But they have hiking organizations, climbing organizations. Room Map at Outdoor Afro has the Outdoor Afro organization that has
Yeah.
chapters, last time I heard, in 30 states. And this is just of people of color getting together and going out in nature. And one of the funny things that we found is people often say they thought that they were the only ones, that they never could find, people like themselves to go out into the woods with. They thought they were unusual to want to go out in nature. But now there's an abundance, a superabundance of people all around the country who are actively doing this. It used to be that when I saw a new group pop up on my Facebook page, I would get all excited. And I still get very excited, but now they're so commonplace. I mean, there must be hundreds and thousands of them. So, and one program in particular that I must cite is the Green and Youth Foundation program out of Atlanta, Georgia. And they have, for the last 11 years, they have been training and placing young people as interns in national parks around the country. They have science interns, and then they have other interns who are focusing on history and culture and interpretation, etc. So they have graduated at least 1,100 people. And wherever I go in the country now, and when people are talking about wanting to become more inclusive in their workforce, I am able to say to them, just reach out to Green and Youth Foundation, and you're likely to find the kind of star power that you're looking for. So it's 180 degrees from where we started.
I am so happy to hear that. I mean,
Yes.
so often programs like this get started. I mean, there were programs that we began way back years ago in the 70s and 80s that just took so long to get off the ground, but it's been slow and steady progress. But I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into this whole notion about people, especially in the past, having felt these barriers to coming to parks. I think I mentioned to you that my family started going to parks in the early 50s. Our parents took us to national parks and to public lands. So how much of the feeling of not being welcomed in national parks is real, and how much may be psychological or imagined barriers for going to national parks? I mean, clearly, when we went to national parks in the 50s, we didn't see many people of color, but felt no barrier or never felt excluded. So in your experience, and what do you communicate to people when you're saying, hey, you are welcome, you should get out here and experience the natural world?
Well, the first great barrier is a lack of information. If you don't have the information, you are unlikely to go look up national. I would not have gone and looked up national park online. I probably couldn't have in 1995 anyway. But you're not going to go looking for something that you don't know about, So I feel that the National Park Service is really lacking in its mission to engage the American public. And the Park Service says that they're not permitted to advertise. And I'm like, well, when does advertising and public information, where do those two diverge? Because we certainly can't keep going on with the lack of invitation to communities of color and the lack of information and the lack of invitation. Those, to me, are the two primary barriers. And a lot of people like to say, I've heard a lot of people say that it's a question of money. And really, I don't find that to be the case, as people find the money to do the things that they want, and vacationing in the national parks is one of the least expensive ways of, getting out and changing your location and changing your view. So I really feel that the greatest barrier is a lack of information and a lack of invitation. And people do not see themselves. There is nowhere in the public domain where people see themselves reflected in the national parks. And once Ayanta, you remember Ayanta then, right? She passed away. But Ayanta and Frank and I took a group of young people to Zion Bryce in Grand Canyon. And many of them were from the very urban and rough areas of LA. And they were flabbergasted. I mean, one young man, a very tough seeming young man, broke down in tears. And he said, how do all these white people speaking French and German, how do all these people from overseas know about these places in my country that I never knew about? He said, people in my neighborhood, the parks that we have are little, places of stubble and dead trees that, the drug people used to shoot up. When you talk about a park, I never could conceptualize something like this. He said, how do all these other people know? And we found out later that other people know because a lot of times, and you know this, a lot of times the convention and visitors bureaus in the gateway communities adjacent national parks, they advertise overseas, right? But they don't advertise in urban American communities. So we never have the opportunity to know that these places exist. We have to kind of find out by ourselves or, find out from our peers, a lot of which is happening now.
Well, you mentioned the media, and which you've been very involved in getting the message out, and quite frankly, what you're saying resonates and is so true. Because had my mother not read Sunset magazine as a vehicle of information, she would have known nothing about national parks.
Exactly.
And it's because she got the information from that magazine that we found out about national parks, and we visited so many national parks in the 50s. And I love telling that story to Bill Lane. Of course, he's passed on now, who was the publisher along with his brother Mel Lane. And I don't know if you ever got to know Bill, that he was a great guy. And
yes,
it's all because of the magazine. And now you are providing that same service through media so that people get the information. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, people who read the New York Times might get something about the parks, yes, national parks, but they might not necessarily see a person of color in the images, right? Lots of times people of color are not in the images, even though now we have lots of superintendents such as Judy Forte in Atlanta and Cassius Cash in Great Smokies and other superintendents that are people of color. And I'm always trying to say to the Park Service, when you have an opportunity to get something about your park in the national media, make sure that you put forward one of your leaders of color so that young people and all Americans can see that there is this diversity, that there is room for non-white people in America's park. So I write a lot for the Black newspapers. I write a blog. In fact, in 2013, I decided to write a blog every single day of the year. It was called 365 Parks, National Parks, in 365 days. It was a very exciting project. And I'll tell you, for the first 3 months, I wrote every single day and published about a national park. And then by the fourth month, I was like, oh, can I take the weekends off? So I did take weekends off, but for 5 days every week, I wrote about a national park. And I mentioned that because although that was in 2013, I was just last week I was contacted by a young woman who wanted to interview me for a travel feature that she's doing on the national parks, targeted to a Black audience. And she said, that's where I know you from, the 365 Parks in 365 Days blog that you wrote that came to me in my mailbox every day. And I had completely forgotten about that. So I cannot begin to overstate the impact that continually putting it out there, that we have a voice, that we have a presence, that we belong in national parks, that we have history there. Oh, can I tell you about the history? Wow.
Let me you just mentioned history, which is a perfect segue to what I was going to ask you next.
Okay.
So the emphasis is often on the big national parks, and that's what you mentioned first, your transcendent experience at Acadia that got you so hooked on national parks. You mentioned Yellowstone and Glacier, Grand Canyon, and Yosemite. But most people don't understand that there are far more historic parks than natural parks. So I wanted to ask you, what's the significance of having this historical, the history of this country preserved in our national historic parks?
Well, we had been going to national parks, I think, for at least a year or two before we discovered the historical sites. And then, of course, our minds were completely blown. I remember I was in Sequoia among the giant sequoia trees, and very, very in awe, that
Mm-hmm.
the fact that these 2,000-year-old trees, such these giants soaring up into the air. And I think it was only on my second visit to Sequoia that I learned how the Buffalo Soldiers were instrumental in saving the giant sequoias in Sequoia National Park in 1903. And I'm certain you know that story,
Of
that
course.
Captain Charles Young and the Buffalo Soldiers were sent by the army from the Presidio of San Francisco. And I think they rode 17 days up to Sequoia, and they were responsible for protecting the trees and the ecosystem from ranchers and lumbermen and people who saw the trees as just so many board feet. And when I found that out, I was like, my God, why doesn't every school child know this story? Now that is not a historical site; it's a national park. And then also, I'm going to go all the way down to Dry Tortugas National Park now in Florida. When we went there and Frank saw the brickwork of Fort Jefferson, which at one point was the largest brick fortification in the Western Hemisphere. And that's the place where Dr. Mudd was imprisoned for his role in the killing of President Lincoln. But when Frank was looking at the brickwork, he said, I bet that this fort was built by enslaved Africans. And there was very little in the material at the park that talked about that. So fortunately, we had helped establish a program in partnership with the national parks called the South Florida Community Partners. And as a result of that, we had access to a park ranger at Everglades and Dry Tortugas who was in the Cultural Resources Division. And he became very interested in our concern about why there were no stories told about the people of color and their contribution. And then we found out that, yes, indeed, a large part of the brick fortification had been built by enslaved Africans. Mm-hmm. And then in Biscayne National Park, a little further north from Dry Tortugas, we learned the story of Sir Lancelot Jones and the Jones family, who at the turn of the 20th century, in 1897, bought an island in Biscayne Bay. Can you imagine that? A black person who had been born into enslavement was able, by 1897, to buy an island in Biscayne Bay. And he and his family lived there. In fact, he named his children, his two sons, Sir Lancelot Jones and King Arthur Jones. And he said that he hoped that by doing that, those names would inspire them to do deeds of great daring. And in fact, it did. King Arthur went off to war, and I'm not sure what happened to him, but Sir Lancelot remained on the island, and he became the favorite bone fishing guide to people like Nixon and Eisenhower and people like the Honeywells, who used to come to a club across the channel from him called the Cocoloba Club. Mm-hmm. But he showed his method in the 1970s when developers came sniffing around to try and buy up his island because they wanted to create another version of Miami Beach. Mm-hmm. And he absolutely refused to sell. And that put a spike in their plans. And then he finally sold to the National Park Service because he said that people need to have a place where they can go and be in the heart of nature and relax. And that was made Biscayne National Monument, which subsequently was expanded and became Biscayne National Park. Then, of course, there's places like the Kingsley Plantation outside of Jacksonville, which, I'm not big on plantation history, but this plantation is very different because the wife she was a Senegalese princess who was captured and traded in Cuba, and a white man named Zephaniah Kingsley acquired her. I can't use the term bought about a human being. Right. And married her. The marriage records are in the courthouse in Jacksonville. And she became the mistress of the plantation. And so when you go to that plantation and the tabby cabins that the enslaved people built are still standing. So when you put your hand against that, I can feel the years roll away. And I'm like back in touch with my ancestors. And I say a prayer of gratitude for the effort that they put into getting us here. And that is significant, that Kingsley Plantation, because one of the descendants of the Kingsleys, Maveen Betch, was very instrumental in getting additional acreage added to the park. And her sister is Joanna. What is her sister's name? She was just in the news recently. Joanna Cole, yes.
Yes.
She was a college president of Spelman and Bennett.
Oh,
And
yes.
she's still very active in
Oh,
civic life.
yes.
Yes,
Oh,
she's
yes,
a
I do.
descendant of that family.
Mm-hmm.
So I am very much in awe of the historic sites that tell the story of our contributions to this great nation. And one of the reasons we are relentless in telling those stories is because we find ourselves in a place in our history now where there's so much distortion of history, where
Yes.
people of a certain race are going around saying how, America was a white country, we want our country back, etc. And we have to say, hey, look at these stories in these places. These stories are not made up. They have to go through rigorous vetting and testing before they're authorized by Congress, and they show that all Americans of every race and stripe, had a hand in creating the country that we know today. And we really want people of color in particular to know that history so that they can push back on that and not have to feel intimidated.
Well, I want you to respond to this quote by Franklin Roosevelt. You're talking about accurate history, the country belonging to all people. Here's something that is extremely significant, I think, that makes your point, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. But Franklin Roosevelt said this, back in the 40s. He said, "There's nothing so American as our national parks. The fundamental idea behind the parks is that the country belongs to the people, and that is in process of making for the enrichment of the lives of all of us."
Wow. I love it. Thank you so much. I'm going to use it the first chance I get. I'm going to go look it up, or I'll ask you to email me that because I want to use it today because it's so fundamental. The other Roosevelt question by Teddy Roosevelt that I love to share is where he said, we, the American people, have inherited the greatest treasury that any nation has ever been privileged to inherit. And the time will come when we will have to show whether or not we are worthy of it. And I think that time is right now. I really think we could make a better showing of it, of how well we deserve it, if, more than 50% of the people in the country didn't know that they exist.
Isn't that the truth? Well, I'd like to leave you with sharing maybe a final thought about what has been, your most rewarding experience in a national park. I know you talked about Acadia, so that gave me goosebumps. But is there maybe another rewarding experience that you had in a national park you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yes. As a result of our passion, I served on the board of the National Parks Conservation Association for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And that allowed me several privileges, one of which was getting to hike down into the Grand Canyon at the South Rim with the superintendent and members of the board and staff from the Park Service. And we got to spend the night at Indian Gardens, in the middle of the canyon, 3,000 feet down. And that is an experience that will live with me forever because I actually had the chance to see the sun withdraw its rays from the canyon walls. I'm sorry to say this, but I describe it as a lover undressing his lady for the night, taking the robe off, the rays taking the going up and dark coming into the canyon, and then the moon sailing overhead. And then next morning, I woke up early enough to see the sunrise. And then again, he was like the lover dressing his lady for the morning. It was so beautiful as the sun's rays just like gently poured down into the canyon. Transformative. And it's one of the experiences that I will most treasure. But then again, I have a lot of them, but that one is one I go to a lot.
Thank you, Audrey. That was just absolutely wonderful. Again, it gives me goosebumps, and I just thank you for sharing these stories in such a personal and passionate, personal and passionate way. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. To find out more about the podcast, you can go to our website at lifeisastorypodcast.com. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave a comment or hit the like button. Stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.